Hi, I'm Anderson Brown. I'm going to talk to you today about Aristotle's physics. This is an introductory level discussion of the physics. I am going to go through really pretty accurately the arguments as they're organized in the physics. It's the first video of four I plan to do on Aristotle. The second one then would be on De Anima, on the soul, its philosophy of mind, and then after that, the poetics and the Nicomachean ethics. I do think, as I think most people do, as in the case of Plato, so in the case of Aristotle, a systematic understanding is important, and the right place to start is with the basic metaphysical assumptions, physical assumptions. Aristotle is very much okay. So I don't want to give a potted, overly formal, dot all the I's introduction to Aristotle's physics today. I want to make this flow a little bit more. I have had some success in making this presentation to undergraduates, and I find that undergraduate students very much enjoy Aristotle's physics and the metaphysics. They're not super tidy texts. They're texts that are different parts of them are more valuable than others. There's some repetition and so on. But I think just a brisk walk through the physics today is what we want to set us up, and also for the rest of Aristotle. Last thing I'll say before going to the slides, then again, Aristotle, I think, is a biological thinker. I always say I think Aristotle, if he were alive today, might very likely be found in a biology department somewhere. That's kind of the kind of thing that he is really interested in. And there's very much a sense of a kind of flow. Sort of Aristotle's topic in the physics is change. He wants to understand basically what change is, and he sees change as a kind of movement. And there's a sort of a flowing that I think, again, in sort of more conventional treatments of Aristotle, or sort of encyclopedia philosophy and treatments of Aristotle, we really don't get. So, for example, the four causes, the material, the efficient, the formal, and the final. But I mean, that's often presented just as sort of something you have to memorize, as if they don't have anything to do with each other or something like that. And this is very much a unified, holistic picture. Anyway, let me get to it and talk about Aristotle's physics today. Here he has, you see that, oops. You see the circular galaxy, because we will finally end up with a kind of discussion of circular motion. And you see the subtitle, Motion, Change, Life. What's called Aristotle's Continuum is really, I think, one of the most important things to get in Aristotle. And basically the topic of this video today, that is, that he thinks when you look at what we're calling life, that's a kind of change. That's also what he means by sort of form, in terms of the form of organisms. What is form? Is it a Platonic entity? Not at all. Form in Aristotle is a kind of process, a form that's sort of finding its way through nature. And motion, change, life, that is fundamentally what change is a kind of motion. And fundamentally what life is a kind of change. And we can run that one back farther. And as I say, Aristotle's continuum is the idea that you start with the physical universe. That's sort of what it is that you're considering. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about today in this discussion of change, which we find in Aristotle's text of physics. Change, the movement of form through matter. It seems natural enough to draw a distinction between Plato and Aristotle, and Aristotle's trying to find, as I'll discuss more today, a kind of middle way between Plato and the materialistic sort of Ionian philosophers around him. But there's an awful lot that's common to this notion of the relationship between form and matter between Plato and Aristotle too. So one of the ways to open our minds to Aristotle is to be able to see ways in which Aristotle is similar to Plato. He wants to insist he's different, and indeed, much of the discussion is talking about the differences. But change as the movement of the form through matter. Another phrase you'll hear is cookie cutter, that the forms say, what are we talking about here? Natural kinds like species. So say the species of horse, and then you talk about, well, it's the form of the horse. And of course, in Plato, the form of the horse is up in Platonic heaven someplace, influencing from afar, just to caricature that. And but if you say it's like a cookie cutter in Aristotle's rendering, again, you get this movement of there's the cookie cutter and it's cutting out the dough. Something much more fluid than that. The thing, my basic, let me step out to say this. My basic metaphor here, I think, is today talking about Aristotle's physics is the flow of water. Now, consider that, though, the flow of water. Water is flowing. Aristotle would see that as the water following the natural course, taking the shape of the course. And in general, I'm thinking, of course, about the force of gravity here, right? The force of gravity for Aristotle is something that's pulling stuff along. Aristotle has much more of a flavor of kind of backwards causation. Forms are the unfolding of a formal process you can see as a kind of pulling from the future, and the flowing of the water being pulled by gravity to run its natural course. And so I think that the analogy is apt. Okay, let's go back to that then. Yep. So Aristotle's basic topic, as I say, in the physics is change. All of these words, change, causation. With Aristotle, you have to sort of get with the groove and see what he means by that word, or what he means by the word that's being translated that way. Since, as in Plato, the formal element, I wondered about this, the catalytic element. I didn't quite want to say the causal element. After all, Aristotle gives us the four causes, and he says there's a material cause. So he's broadened this cause. We'll talk about that in a second. But it is, as I say, this sense of form kind of flowing. The forms are flowing through the matter. And remember, this also isn't random, because Aristotle has a holistic view of the cosmos as a whole, and he thinks that everything in the cosmos is also playing some kind of role that functions to contribute to the whole. Second bullet point, one might challenge the claim that form is always in this sense, the explanatory cause of change. Again, what's Aristotle interested in? Mostly is interested in organisms and artifacts as examples of substance. Substance is primary being, and it is the unity of form and matter. So form always the explanatory cause of change by appealing. So the second bullet point says this. Look, the builder has to get the right kind of bricks and the right kind of sand and the right kind of wood. The instrument maker has to get exactly the right kind of wood to use. So you can't be saying that the form is the only cause. I mean, after all, didn't we say there was the final cause and the efficient cause and the material cause? But Aristotle, remember, says that primary being is heterogeneous. Primary being is a complex of form and matter. Intuitively, if we're just doing metaphysics, I think most ordinary people and most philosophers, if you ask them to talk about or think about primary being, one intuition you would have would be that primary being would be some kind of singular thing, a homogeneous thing. One price for to follow Aristotle in this kind of middle way between the ontological dualism of Plato that he thinks is too much, and the reductive materialism of Democritus and the atomists that he thinks is reductive in the bad sense, is to understand that the price you have to pay there is that primary being is a complex. It's the unity of form and matter. That's what he says. Whether that might be counterintuitive in terms of a basic metaphysical move, it's the move that Aristotle makes, and it just reflects this larger point that I mentioned before, that Aristotle just starts with the cosmos, the universe, as it is. It's the datum. And he really sticks to that in a really interesting way. He's sort of the consummate scientist that way, I think. I think it's one of the most interesting things about him. Again, it's often referred to as the continuum. Okay, so in the case of then these materials, right, what was the problem? The problem was, well, it seems as if the builder of the house has to buy the right materials. I mean, don't they? So, but again, substance is the unity of form and matter. All matter everywhere is already in some kind of form, and in fact, in form and form. You get, this is the third bullet point again. forms are nested, substances are nested. Substance is the unity of matter and form. And so Socrates is a man, and Socrates is a primate, and a primate is a mammal, and a mammal is a vertebrae, and etc. Except last bullet point, and this is what I was just talking about. Remember, Socrates comes first. Socrates isn't sort of a product of those things. When we say that Socrates is a man and a man is a primate and a primate is a mammal and so on, we're offering a description of the world as we find it. It's nominalism in the sense that what there are sets of physical things. That's what's sort of meant by forms. Socrates is one of these humans. He's a member of the set of organisms, the humans. But that's what we find. We're not explaining how come Socrates is there. See, Socrates is there. That's where we start, and that's what I mean by the continuum. But more generically, there's a surface, and because there's a surface, then there are coordinates, and because there's coordinates, he's used the word place. And then there is space, and because of space, then there is distance, and then you get time, and then you get motion. But see, none of those things exist independently. They're all just manifestations of the original surface, the fact that the universe exists. That's the continuum, and it's key to understanding Aristotle's thought. Okay. So causation and explanation. Again, if you talk about the four causes, normally nowadays, philosophers who are interested in causation would be talking maybe, or scientists who would be talking about something like what Aristotle calls the efficient causation, sort of proximate moving force that's causing something. Explanation is probably as good as causation, a word for what Aristotle wants. Aristotle thinks you're asking, he always puts in terms of what the question, what is this? And in this case, why is this? What is the explanation? And he would take what we translate as causation. I think he's talking about sort of, well, what are all the answers to the why is this here question? And so the second bullet point, this is important. Again, I don't want to linger over this like people do in classrooms all across this great land of ours. Going over the four causes, the material, the efficient, the formal, and the final, but only to point out here that what we're really talking about there is a flow. All of those things are united. You can't have one without the other. It's all sort of different facets of the same event. In a way, I think you might want to think about the cosmos not as an object, but rather as an event or a process itself, since Aristotle thinks that form, as it manifests in the material world, is basically a process. That is, form is in the form of process, a change, a kind of ordered change of a natural kind. As I said, the last bullet point, then the third bullet point, as I said before, with the continuum, you get the sense that all of these different sort of categories, time, change, motion, space, are actually not independent categories. They're all just different ways of describing the same thing, which just is the cosmos itself. Not much difference ultimately between the concept of change as motion and the concept of form itself. What is form? Well, form in an organism is this motion, this process, which is the life process, which is the psyche or the soul of the thing. No Cartesian mind in Aristotle. Again, one of the very appealing things, if you ask me, about his philosophy, a good reason to be interested in him. So as I say, the identity function that it is that form just is a kind of movement, which that is, I had that backwards. That here would be running it all the way back. That what we're calling psyche or mind just is a kind of life, natural kind, which is a kind of change, which is a kind of movement, which just is what we mean by form in nature. So they're not different things, and so he understands then that you might be fooled into thinking that there should be a metaphysical discussion, which there is not. He's very good that way. Synonymy, causal synonymy, fancy word. What does it mean? Again, this is another way of getting to the point that I'm making here, that what you're looking at is form kind of flowing into the matter, flowing through the matter. in a way that's being pulled along in the same sort of very organic way as the gravity is sort of pulling the water along. And remember, gravity is teleological. It's pulling stuff along. It looks like it's got, sort of a goal. Um, Causal synonymy, it sounds fancy. Just the idea that the causal agent has to have the causal effect. Cause of something becoming red must have redness in itself. There's extensive and very interesting discussion of this in Plato, including the late Plato of books of dialogues like the Sophists and the Parmenides. Predication, right? So the question here for Aristotle, right? Form is moving along through nature. So this is another way of saying that the effect is the cause in a sense. Like both are manifestations of the form. So second bullet point, change is form flowing through nature like water. So then there's another concept, Aristotle talks about potentialities in things. Again, because he wants to be a kind of non-reductive materialist. So where is he going to put, say, certain modal possibilities? He's going to explain them as potentialities that are in the substances that already exist. Then he introduces another phrase, and the poor student at that point, feels bad, does a faceplant, because he says privations. What the heck are privations? But now we can understand that, because privations, right? The water's flowing along. The water's flowing into these areas that are fit for it. And when Aristotle says privations, he means privations of form, by which he means potentialities. That is, potentialities are really privations, because what's really happening is that the form is kind of moving into something where it can move into, because there's nothing else there. There's nothing manifesting. So that's that sense of privations. And I think getting it that way really does help to understand the sense of changing as kind of a flowing of form through matter. Last bullet point then on this slide. Teleological causation can be understood as a cause that lies in the future, the final cause. Aristotle says something like this, is really basic. You're looking at an organism. The atomist wants to say that the organism is just the sum total of all the organs, all the parts. But Aristotle says that's backwards. Think about, again, what's the question? The question is the what is it question about something. So say you have an organ from an organism, and you can give your physical description of it. It's red, it weighs 8 pounds, it's got 4 chambers, it's made out of muscle, whatever you will. But sooner or later, someone has to realize this is a pump. What this organ does is it moves the blood through the body. And once you understand the function of the organ and the larger organism, that is when you understand the what is it question. The essential property that it has is not a physical property, it's a functional property. And that's what Aristotle's teleology is all about. And, you cannot understand the individual organ outside of the context of the larger organism. And he suggests that understanding in the cosmos as a whole is like that. So, all right, moving on then. And as I was saying before, then there are I think Martha Nussbaum, one of our best working philosophers, has pointed this out, if I'm not mistaken, that there are some similarities between Aristotle and Wittgenstein here, in as much as Aristotle here warns us off of some of these metaphysical discussions that he thinks might be spurious. That is, there's no universal motion or sort of generic or transcendental notion of motion or of change. They're just different aspects or angles of describing what we see when we look at the natural world. There are as many, first bullet point, there are as many kinds of motion and change as there are kinds of being. Because again, we start with the substances. And David Hume also makes this point. David Hume, in fact, makes this point about the word substance. Because in the 18th century, philosophers have been carried off onto a big discussion about substance in itself. And Hume says, look, this word has come out of the grammar, and now you think there's some sort of category and there's this generic notion of substance. But there's no reason to think that there's any such thing. There's just all the substances that we encounter in our experience. And Wittgenstein would identify that as what he likes to call metaphysical grammar. That is, it looks like there's a philosophical problem that is really a misunderstanding of the way that the language is working there. And Aristotle makes this point in the physics. Motion doesn't have to be some sort of freestanding metaphysical category. Aristotle again says, look, motion is a function of the surface in the first place. It's the surface that in itself, by virtue that there is a surface, then just constitutes there being places and spaces and distances and velocities and motions and changes. Last bullet point then, just to sum that up, since Aristotle middle bullet point just said, it is one of those little rinky dink, but it is in this case makes the point well, that we use change to describe, Aristotle says, coming to be and passing away of substances, changes in the properties of substances, non-essential properties, accidental. Quantitative changes of location. So again, when we talk about change or motions, quote unquote, these are linguistic categories that are picking out some fairly disparate things. Last bullet point. Since Aristotle takes the existence of the whole cosmos understood as substance, in fact, as a substance, it seems, as the starting point of inquiry. That's what we start with. So he doesn't really, he's a scientist, I'm not sure. He shows little interest in cosmogony, the origins of the cosmos. That is, let me be clear on that, because that could, he shows little interest in a physicalist story about cosmogony, that he's not sure that that's something that's really required. There's a difference between a story in terms of physical causation and a story in terms of teleological causation. So it's on that level of where we're trying to tell a story about physical causation that Aristotle's quite skeptical that there's going to be some sort of physical language origin story about the universe, and he has some reasons for thinking that. He notes it's neither logically nor physically necessary, as far as anyone can show, that material being has an origin at all. And in Aristotle's teleology, the essential cause is the end of the causal process, right? Not at the beginning. It's not a picture of causation where everything sort of depends on some sort of initial event or initial state. The continuousness of time and space, again, getting what's called the continuum, slightly different from what I'm calling here the relational theory of space and time. We already can see that pretty clearly here. That is, again, it looks like it might be a contingency for all we know, that there is a surface, but there is one. There's a cosmos. There are things. And so therefore, there are these things, space and time, but those are also, again, just other words that we use to describe this cosmos. It has as features space and time. They're not things that can exist in the absence. Okay, so that was what the last slide was about. Second bullet point on this slide. Since time and space have no independent existence, they cannot be said to be composed of anything. They're not separable things. They're continuous. They don't have parts. They don't have any parts at all. Space and time are relational things, strictly dependent, do not have their own sort of within themselves any kind of constituents or parts. So they are then continuous. Now here we get to an argument. It starts out as Aristotle's argument with the atomists. He then expands it to an argument with the Eleatic Zeno, and it is really core stuff to understand Aristotle altogether and to understand the physics. So let's do it carefully. Let me step out to see if let me try and do this. So you have someone like Democritus. Democritus has an argument that goes something like this. Democritus says, it must be that there's a bottom level of reality, because it must be that there's something that's so small that it cannot be divided any further. He appeals to physicalist intuitions that there aren't infinite sets in nature. And it's interesting because Aristotle also has complicated ideas about the relationship of the physical world to infinite sets. So Democritus coins this word, the atom, the thing that cannot be divided, and says then that fundamental ontology, according to Democritus, is atoms swirling in the void, which come together to form worlds. And Aristotle is opposed to this reductive materialism. Reductive materialism, it says everything ultimately can be explained in terms of these atoms swirling in the void. Aristotle rejects that. And here's the argument, a key argument there, right? Aristotle says that, look, you can't really divide real things at all. Real things are wholes. It's teleology. Think of an organism. It's a joke in class, right? You can measure me. This is a macabre. Well, you can measure me, right? You can say I'm 6 feet tall. You can divide me up that way by measurement all you want, but you can't cut me in half. Okay, I'm sure you saw that coming, right? And because I'm an organism, if you do that one time, I'm not divisible, just simply not physically divisible at all. But then neither is the classroom floor, and that's going to be important when we get to discussing Zenos paradoxes, which is the next application of this argument. In terms of the atomists, though, the argument here is pretty straightforward, that you're making an equivocation. I think we can go back to the slide, and I probably discussed that better. Last bullet point. Aristotle rejects atomism as committing a fallacy of equivocation, using a word in 2 different ways, but not notice that you are. It's a fallacy that Aristotle is always very alert to, confusing the division of measurement, which can be infinite. In fact, there's infinities between infinities in measurement. Measurement is conventional. With the division of substances, primary being, organisms and functional artifacts can't be divided even once and preserve their identity. There's no physical division of an organism without the end of the organism. So again, the fallacy is the fallacy of equivocation, and this is what he fundamentally accuses the atomists of falling into, thinking that there must be some bottom division when there aren't actually any divisions at all. Right? Time and space are continuous, and so are all the surfaces, the surface, if you will. Okay, so then Zenos paradox. Zeno's famous paradoxes were, I'll just read through it. Zeno's famous paradoxes were perhaps a form of philosophical theater. People found Parmenides' teaching that everything was an unchanging, eternal one. That was influential in an odd way with subsequent Greek physics, but it certainly sounded very mystical. Parmenides, I mean, among other things, one thing that's historically significant about Parmenides is, here's the philosopher sort of sitting in his chair thinking about things, and he comes up with an argument that's powerful and interesting. He's getting into modal logic here about that the universe isn't what it appears to be, that the universe must logically be such that it's nothing like what it appears to be. That's what's interesting about Parmenides, but people said that it was too fantastic, leading to paradoxes, such as there's only one thing. I mean, yeah, it's real paradoxical. But Zeno says, yeah, but look, the way ordinary people think about division is paradoxical in the same way. I can motivate these paradoxes in the same way. Second bullet point, these are what they are. You know what they are. The professor can't walk across the floor because he's got to walk across the first half of the floor before he gets to the beginning of the second half. And then he's got to do that again, and he's got to do it infinitum, so he can't get to the other side. But remember Aristotle's critique of the atomists, which was a critique in a serious physical discussion. He already showed that they were making a fatal equivocation between the fact that you can divide up things in formal measurement, but you can't actually divide up substance at all. Aristotle points out that physically speaking, that is, in the sense they're real substances, neither the artifactual classroom floor nor the organismic professor could be divided even once and preserve their identities. So again, it's just exactly the same critique that he makes against Zeno and Zeno's paradoxes as he makes against the atomists, that it's a fallacy of equivocation. And that comes back to what I keep mentioning, which is this notion of the continuum, of the universe's continuum. That's really, I think, a key to understanding the way Aristotle thinks about, certainly about matter and physics. So, so about these infinite sets again, there's two senses of first cause that I think can get mixed up in Aristotle. And at the end of the physics, Aristotle gets into the unmoved mover, which is one of the most vexatious areas. It's one area where, for example, secular interpreters who would like him to be completely secular find it rather vexatious that he seems to be talking about some sort of intentional deity thing. I don't have an opinion about that, by the way, at all, but I'm just going to tell you about it right now. So two senses of first cause. First bullet point. As we've seen, Aristotle warns us off confuting the existence of the infinite sets of measurement. Those are conventions. There's between any two integers, there's infinite sets of infinite sets. With the existence of infinite sets of actual things, infinite sets of horses, infinite sets of spaces. He doesn't remember, he thinks space is continuous, doesn't have parts. He doubts that there are any of those. However, it does not follow that time had to have a beginning. Notably, there's no argument for the unmoved mover with this basis. That is, whatever arguments Aristotle presents for the existence of an unmoved mover, he doesn't say there has to have been a physical cause, which itself did not have a physical cause. That's a mistake. And I think that's a widespread mistake in Aristotle interpretation. Time on Aristotle's view, third bullet point, is a function of motion or change. Remember, time just is a kind of motion or change. And motion and change are functions of there being space, again, which is a function of the surface or the cosmos. This is the continuum. So in this context, then, the significance of mentioning that is then, if you ask the question, well, when did time begin, right? When did time begin? What do you mean, when did it begin? At what time did time begin? So again, it's just paradoxical to try to talk about the beginning of time. In Aristotle, the question of when did time begin is really just the question of when did the cosmos begin? Because remember, time is just a function of space, which is just a function of the surface. So there is no question of when did time begin per se. There's nothing that's time per se, other than just what this description of the surface. The cosmogenic question is incoherent, as time only exists when the cosmos exists. Time is just part of the description of the cosmos. And so again, the cosmos is the datum. That's the thing about Aristotle. He doesn't need an initial physical cause that has no physical cause itself. And he doubts that there is anything like a physical cause that doesn't itself have a physical cause. So that's that first sense of first cause that you want to clear up, and then look at what he says about the unmoved mover. And again, the unmoved mover, an expression of teleology. It's entirely a teleological thing. The unmoved mover, I think probably the best way to conceive of the ontology of the unmoved mover is the way that we conceive of the ontology of forms of natural kinds, that it really is the form that's embodied in the movement and cycle of the cosmos itself, in the same way that I embody human form as a human organism going through a human life cycle. Okay, so the unmoved mover is an expression of Aristotle's teleology. Everything has a function, a role to play in the whole, like the organ does in the organism. And that's causal, right? Explanatory. It's always going to be wrong to think that you're only talking about linear chains of causality reaching up from the past. The telos of the cosmos will be the realization of what unifies all things into an organic whole. Sounds kind of cosmic, right? But just the realization of what unifies me into an organic whole as an organism, or my dog into an organic whole as an organism. It's the life cycle of the organism. Okay, so that's really what the unmoved mover is, not an entity located in some temporal place. Past that, at least it would be better to realize that the unmoved mover, if located like that, would be at the end of things, because the unmoved mover then would just be the delos itself, the ultimate state. As I said in the last slide, where, so you don't want to be thinking of that notion of the unmoved mover at the beginning of that physical sense. It's a mistake. The second bullet point, the formal notion of the cosmos as an organic functional whole is what Aristotle means by unmoved mover, not some causally independent entity, not some Platonic thing. Same treatment of Platonic forms, notice, as you get of Cartesian mind. They both sort of disappear in terms of being independently existing ontological notions and just become sort of aspects of this process, this formal process. Life cycle is form and motion, life a kind of change, and the cosmos, he thinks, is such an organism. Oops, let me go back. I think that's more defensible than Plato's claim that the cosmos is an intentional, rational being, but I'll just flag that. I'm not real big on the idea that cosmos is a person either way. Third bullet point, only at the very end of the physics. Now, this is what I was talking about before. We should understand this is the end. Does Aristotle suggest any more traditional sounding story of cosmic intention, right? Of a deity that's doing something intentionally. He says that the unmoved mover turned the celestial realm on its axis. He means the stars, right? The stars are rotating around Polaris, and the heavens are moving in a circular motion, which is considered to be a more perfect kind of motion. There's a large discussion about whether the celestial realms are better ordered, sort of in a Platonic Apollonian sense, than the sublunary under the moon realms. And he says that what happened at the beginning was that the stars, that the celestial realm was put into rotation, and that all the rest of motion is that, right, is a subset of that. And so the last bullet point, I just, you know me, it's just, but I would just point out, I mean, in the Taijitu, the yin yang symbol, in terms of the cosmology and Taoism behind that, I mean, the idea is you had a formless being, a kind of on the verge between nothing and something, really, and then a line formed through it, a division. Again, it's the integer, the one and the many, and it started to rotate, and all of the individual things all come out of the one. It's the story about the relationship between the one and the many. And I would only say that when Aristotle ends the physics by saying that the unmoved mover, originally turned the heavens and started it to rotate, and everything else follows from that, it's not too far out. It's about 200 years out. Anyway, I don't know. Like I say, that's just me. Let me come out of here. So a less formal, sort of brisker discussion of what's going on in Aristotle's physics. I hope it's useful to you. Again, I curious to see if that's useful. But in any event, as I say, I'm going to then go on next to a discussion of philosophy of mind. Of course, as you know, philosophy of mind is one of the things I'm most interested in. So thank you for sticking with me to the end of my discussion of Aristotle's physics. Mom. Okay. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.